as we approach the inauguration of Donald Trump on January 20th, I was reflecting on the hilarity of the 51st state drama with Justin Trudeau resigning in this big back and forth about tariffs. And it led me down a couple paths of thought that I felt were worth sharing. And when it comes to the drama of politics, it's so easy for all of us to get sucked into the drama. I mean, the president, of course, always sucks the air out of the room, and Donald Trump is, we should say, an expert by himself at sucking the air out of the room. We've got all this stuff going on, like, he wants to buy Greenland, and let's rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. And now I'm seeing memes flying back and forth of like, hey, we just wanted help with our groceries, and now you're talking about spending energy on renaming the Gulf of Mexico to something else. What are you doing? How are you such a clown? Is it the people who voted for him who are upset, or the left trying to instigate contention within his vote? But I mean, it's just all ridiculous drama, and I think it's worth taking a step back, because first and foremost, again, I wanted to start with this 51st state thing with Canada. It's very fascinating to put into perspective that I remember listening to a American history lecture that the founding fathers, as if they all thought unanimously on things, but this one appears to be a more unanimous thought, felt that it was a matter of time before Canada was annexed by the United States, way back when. And the person presenting, unfortunately I can't remember his name, said that if the founding fathers were to come back today, or maybe Thomas Jefferson or whoever were to come back today, the first thing that would probably shock them the absolute most would be that Canada never actually became part of the United States. So when Donald Trump is joking, not joking, get into that in a second, of whether or not to include, to annex Canada as the 51st state or 7 more states, or whatever it would theoretically be, there's actually a foundational historical context for that. But second, I should say, what I just said was first. Second, is the incoming president actually interested in annexing Canada? I don't think he is at all. And I don't think he's just being a flippant idiot, but with his, Trudeau is the governor of Canada, and Canada's going to become the 51st state thing. What I think he's doing is he's setting the frame for negotiations. So what's the claim here? Which I'm going to disagree with the claim in a minute, but we'll get to that. The claim by Trump is that Canada has been taking advantage of the United States on a trade balance, with the idea that more money is going toward Canada from the United States than money is coming to the United States from Canada, right? So the idea being, okay, the amount of stuff that the United States is exporting into Canada and the money that we receive back from Canada for those exports, compared to the amount of stuff that Canada is exporting to the United States and money received back from the United States to Canada, if you sum all that up, the net flow of money is to Canada. And according to Trump, this is a bad thing because, hey, we're losing money. And so there's this argument on, we're going to, apply tariffs in order to get you back to the negotiating table. And I think negotiating table is the real thing that's going on here. Because if you think about it, what he's doing is very belittling, right? Which is, one of the reasons a lot of the people who I would say mostly people in quotes on the right that don't like Trump, or these people who pretending on be on the right who don't like Trump, whatever, it's part of the drama, criticize him for he's not presidential, and he's just a big meanie, and he swears and says all these crazy things on X or Twitter or Truth Social, whatever the heck it is now, and he doesn't. He's just bombastic and doesn't know what he's doing. I think this is a guy who builds skyscrapers, right? I think he knows exactly what he's doing. And from a negotiating standpoint, what it looks like to me is he's setting the frame before the negotiation because he can't actually negotiate yet. He's not the president, but he's getting ready to negotiate. And the frame that he's setting for the people who are going to be sitting across the table for him is that they are belittled and they have basically no negotiating leverage. Is what he's setting them up for. Because I mean, think about it. Like, hey, Canada. First and foremost, did Justin Trudeau quit because of the humiliation that caused strife internally with the internal politics that eventually led him to resign? I don't know, but I could see that being a contributing factor to Justin Trudeau resigning. So let's just. I mean, and even if it wasn't, I'm sure Trump will claim credit for it, right? So let's say Trump is able to claim credit for getting the leader of the other country to resign, and then continuously makes fun of that other country for simply being a subsidiary of our country, which, when you look at the economic data, that really does appear to be the case simply from geography, because the way that the geography works, it's much more difficult to go east to west in Canada than it is to go north to south. So most of the Canadian provinces, because I mean, they're like these big rectangles that go north to south, right? They do more commerce with the states to the south of them than they do with each other, right? So it's not completely without merit to say that Canada is economically subordinate to the United States. But if he's constantly putting this frame that you're just the 51st state, you're actually under our jurisdiction, and you're just subordinate to us, by the time they actually get to the negotiating table, whoever's going to be negotiating on the other side of Donald Trump, before they can even negotiate, that guy's got to dig himself out of the frame, right? And the frame is, who are you? You're my subordinate. What right do you have to negotiate anything? I hold all the cards. No, wait a minute. The reason I have all the cards, and anybody who knows anything about negotiations knows that if you're explaining anything, you're losing. If you're explaining anything, you're losing. And I mean, go read the book Pitch Anything. Fascinating book. And it's basically, I think the guy's named Oren Klaff. I got that wrong. I got the book over in the other room. It's this guy who's basically making the claim that you don't really have to know anything or be good at explaining whatever it is you're trying to pitch, as long as you understand like how to act like an alpha in the moment and how to get the person to be a beta in the moment. That really controls the dynamic much more than whatever facts are thrown on the table. An example that he gives in the book was actually Walmart. That, and I don't know if this is the case of Walmart anymore, this is what he's reporting in the book, that if you want to sell something at Walmart, or at least at the time if you wanted to sell something at Walmart, you actually had to show up to Walmart Central, which is like this massive building where you walk up to this like completely indifferent, boring secretary person who tells you to go sit down and wait at these, that basically look like kindergarten desks. It's basically to make you feel like a child. There's some boring vending machines with Walmart products. And then when they finally call you over, they bring you through these hallways of like these individual tiny rooms with one little window on it. I mean, kind of looks like a prison or like a music practice area. If you've ever been like in a musical building in a university where you have like these small individual rooms so people could go to these rooms and practice their instruments. And each person who wants to sell something to Walmart gets stuck in one of these rooms, so that you get stuck in one of these rooms, and then you just have to sit there and wait. And finally, somebody shows up with a clipboard who asks these incredibly boring, tough questions, like, "Hey, you know, we need you to cut these costs by 50% if you wanna, cut the cost by 50% if you wanna do business with us." And basically by the time that you get to the point where you're able to talk to the person, you're just so belittled, befuddled, and betaed, you have no voice. Negotiations is so much more about that sort of dynamic, like setting up the frame, than it is about, well, okay, well, here's this number over here, and here's this number over here, and we want this number, and you want that number, and how do we come to set it? It's way less about that and much, much more about this frame setting. So what I think Trump is doing is frame setting for whatever the heck it is that he wants. And I mean, is it the tariffs? Does he want the cash balance to start being balanced, or have more money flow this way than that? I don't know exactly what he wants, but what he's doing, I think, is setting up the frame for the negotiating table. So so that Canada is completely betaed by the time they get to the negotiating table. And, you know, don't get sucked into the drama. I mean, even it's tempting to get sucked into this drama about the Gulf of America and buying Greenland and all this sort of stuff. And I want to get into buying Greenland next, because the drama, I think, also overshadows something very important. Is this guy's not an idiot. You don't build skyscrapers and become the president with all forces working against you by being an idiot, right? He's got a style, and that style can appear idiotic. However, to say that the guy doesn't know what he's doing in a negotiation it's pretty idiotic. And I think, and Greenland gets into this, what Trump is doing, he's giving the United States, I would say, a voice again, but he's utilizing the fact that the United States plays nice. What do I mean by that? So, the United States, by far, like to say, there's really not even a second place, both economically and militarily, is the strongest country the world has ever seen multiple times over. And particularly militarily, I've been watching a lot of geopolitical channels, YouTube channels recently, right? And I was watching this one that went over that if you took mutually assured destruction off the table just for a moment, right? Everybody sends nukes and the whole world blows up and there's nothing left after that. If you took that off the table just for this thought experiment, that if the entire world outside of the United States all declared war on the United States at the same time, the United States would mop the floor with the entire rest of the world. That's how much more advanced and more powerful the United States military is all over the entire world. Then when you look at it economically, we are one of the rare, is it like the only country where energy independent from oil and natural gas. And in fact, natural gas is a byproduct of our energy creation. We're food independent. I don't think we're 100% fertilizer independent, but we're pretty close. We're relatively safe in the sense of we have this crazy military, but also that we're not in the kind of Afro-Eurasian conglomerate where you have all these cultures lapsed over all these resources and geographies that have been fighting each other for thousands and thousands of years without any, they don't necessarily have natural borders to protect themselves, right? We have great natural borders and friendly neighbors to the north and south. So what we've been doing since the end of World War II is the United States has, on its own dime, been patrolling the oceans of the world so everybody can trade without fear of their trade getting destroyed or captured by a enemy or privateering country, right? So the United States on its own dime, and apparently the reason for this was that after World War II, we wanted help to fight against the Soviet Union, and it was literally a bribe. Well, we said, hey, not for any economic reason. This is a foreign policy reason on our part. We will spend our money to keep the world seas safe, so you guys can trade as long as we get to dictate what your foreign policy is. That was the trade-off. And now the three things going through my head at once. The United States is so strong, we're so independent, and we take care of so many other countries that it's really laughable how other countries take advantage of us. And we just kind of roll over and take it. I mean, one of the examples is and Trump's brought this up for his second term, and he addressed it in his first term, and he actually got some leeway, traction going on it, is that Europe barely pays its own NATO bills, or it's not meeting the commitments that it said it would for its NATO bills, and the United States has been backing it uh, are making up the difference the entire time. Another thing I was watching, the recent interview between Zelensky and Lex Friedman. I haven't finished it yet, but one of the things that Zelensky said, because Friedman and Zelensky were talking about NATO, is that the United States is really NATO, right? Like if Zelensky was theorizing if Trump came out of NATO, then the whole NATO apparatus fails to be significant or fails to achieve whatever it was supposed to achieve, because the United States is really the foundation of the whole concept of NATO, which means, okay, so the United States has been protecting Europe for its entire security purposes since the end of World War II, and I'm getting here from Greenland, right? Because there's this talk about buying Greenland, which on one hand it's kind of silly. I totally support buying Greenland. Why not? It's supposedly under all that ice, an incredible amount of natural resources that could be exploited. I don't know how well they could be exploited while they're still under ice, but I guess presumably there is stuff that if with a little bit of effort we could go find more natural resources to exploit up in Greenland. So what a great territory for the U.S. to acquire. And I think was it Macron or some official out of France post this tweet of rejecting American imperialism. And hey, we're not going to stand up for this. We're here to protect Denmark and we're here to protect Greenland. And it's like, what are you going to do about it? Right? We protect the world's oceans, and we protect NATO, which is essentially protecting you against Russia. I mean, not to dive into if Russia's the good guy or the bad guy, or Ukraine's the good guy or the bad guy. Europe has always had the threat of Russia. And Europe has always had the threat of Germany, and Europe has always had the threat of France. So, I mean, this goes back to what I was saying before, is like this area of the world has just been under constant warfare for thousands and thousands of years, right? And for a brief moment, from World War II until, I guess, the invasion of Ukraine, it's been pretty calm because the United States has guaranteed security, and B, been the entity which has kept the USSR in check while it was still the USSR. So we're really holding the whole thing together. We're really holding the whole world order together. Oh, and I mean, just as a side note, just to mention China before somebody jumps up with that. So, well, China, the economy of China and the military of China is about to phase out of existence on its own accord. Just go look at some demographic information from China. Between the one-child policy and the fact that nobody is having any kids, I mean, by 2050, I think it's estimated that half the population of China is going to be gone because the old people have aged out and they literally didn't have the kids to replace themselves. So we're really looking at China ceasing to be a single functioning nation in the not too distant future. So I mean, regardless of whatever China's doing or supposedly doing, or the nefarious things, or they got 200 million man military, or they built a new aircraft carrier that was designed off a cruise ship, or look at the economic something. China it's just on its way out, on its own accord. It's completely on its way out on its own accord. But going back to the United States is really holding everything together. I don't think it's a big ask to say, look, we're holding everything together. You guys everybody else needs to treat us with a little bit more respect here. I think that's what Trump is getting at. Everybody else needs to treat us with a little bit more respect here because we're holding everything together. Now, what I don't mean by that is, okay, let's go invade this country, let's go invade that country, let's do, blow this up and Iraq this and nation build. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is if we want to fucking buy Greenland, that's between us and Greenland/Denmark, right? Like, France can go take a hike. If we want to adjust the way that we do business with Canada, Canada could suck it up, right? I mean, I want Canada to flourish. I want Canada to be a great place. I don't think I really want you to become part of the United States because I fear what that would do to the Electoral College. But we have the ability to do these things, and everybody just takes advantage of us and says, oh, you're this evil empire and whatever. And yes, there is an evil empire nature to the United States. Absolutely. I mean, I just said Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Blowing up Libya. there is an evil empire nature to the United States, but it's nothing. It's nothing compared to, for example, the USSR slash Russia. It's nothing compared to China, right? At least when we go about what we go about the United States, there's this assumption of human rights that we're supposed to live up to. We don't live up to it, but we still measure it by that, right? Other places around the world, they don't do that. In almost all of human history, you go in, you rape, you pillage, you slaughter, you take what you can, and you go, we won, aren't we great? There's no self-reflection, right? There's no, hey, wait a minute, hey, aren't all humans equal and we shouldn't be doing this to other humans? There's no breaks, right? What I'm saying is, yes, the United States is evil stuff, but we have like a culture that carries its own breaks to try to slow us down from doing evil things like this. Other cultures don't have that. They don't have that. And I mean, if you don't know enough Russian history, before the USSR, during the USSR, after the USSR, I don't know what to tell you. I'm glad I didn't get born in Russia. Like, Russian history is gnarly. Chinese history is gnarly. So just going back to Trump here. When he's bombastic, when he's belittling Justin Trudeau, making fun of Canada for being the 51st state, this thing about Greenland. I'm not sure what's up with the Gulf of America. I don't even have an opinion on that. But he's not dumb. He's got something in mind. We might disagree with what he's got in mind. I am going to disagree with something in a second. We might disagree what he has in mind, but I think he's really getting at, I mean, and isn't this kind of the ethos of making America great again? He's really getting at, look, we're the richest country on earth. We're not the only country on earth. There's other people. We want to respect them. We want them to be successful. But we have been holding you all up, and we don't need to take your shit. Right? If we've been supporting you, we don't need to take your shit. If you have a bad attitude about the fact that, hey, wait a minute, maybe we don't want to support you anymore because we don't like your attitude. Oh, we're just going to have a bigger attitude about it. I mean, remember, did you see the clip of when Trump was having the discussion with the European leaders about paying for NATO, and he was essentially saying something to these leaders like, I expect you to start paying more right now. Not a year from now, not a month from now. Don't go back to your relative countries and talk about it. I expect you to start paying for it right now. And like the people around the table were laughing at him. Why are you laughing at us? We pay for it. Your protection. And the countries over there right now are sweating fucking balls because of Russia. Well, Dylan, how do you know that Russia wants to go past Ukraine? And that's not what I'm talking about. Historically speaking, there's a lot of countries in Europe that have over and over and over again been conquered by Russia, right? It's not like there's no historical context of Russia coming in there over and over and over and over and over again. Take Finland, for example. Take the Balkan states. Not the Balkan states. The ones up north: Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. Though I mean. Take Poland, for example. They have just been harassed by Russia over and over and over again. And this idea that, well, NATO is just expanding in Russia's direction and they're being mean to Russia, completely overlooks the fact that these countries were jumping up and down trying to get into NATO because they have such a ridiculous history of Russia invading them over and over and over again, and they wanted protection against Russia. So, I mean, I don't know what Russia's going to do. I don't know what's in Putin's head, but I'm just saying that there is a very big historical precedent that these countries are worried about Russia invading them. So for them to sit at the motherfucking table and laugh at Trump back in 2016 or 17 or whatever it was, about them paying up for their, in quotes, fair share of NATO, I mean, talk about disrespectful. So I think getting some respect, particularly because we're funding the whole thing and protecting you, right? So getting some respect on the table, I think, is one of the things that he's going for. And it's more than just respect, because once you have the respect, then the negotiations go differently. And I'm very excited to see how these Canadian negotiations go. And on the topic of that, let's talk about Canada. Or I should say, let's talk about trade. Because one of the things about this show that we hope to rub everybody the wrong way on until you come to the dark side is economic issues. So it's no secret that we're MMTers here, modern monetary theorists here. And modern monetary theory has gotten a bad rap for, I would say, two reasons. The first reason is a bunch of crazy lefties have, I won't say that they've latched onto it, I wouldn't say that they have accepted it. I would say they've latched onto it because I think they see it as a, hey, if I say MMT, that gives me the reason for the magic money and resource. Like, I can have my free healthcare, I can have my free college, I can have my free childcare, I can have my universal basic income. Because MMT, I don't understand what it is, but I'll just say MMT and jump up and down and hope for my free stuff. The other reason I think it has a bad rep is because it sounds completely nonsensical if you've been trained or exposed in any way to the classical interpretation of economics. Now, I'm going to say something controversial here. Absolutely, completely bizarre. Would you be shocked? Would you be shocked if I told you that there is a societal organization called the government that influences education, right? The educational system, government, that sort of thing. There's a societal organization that trains you to think in a way that's untrue and not for your benefit. I bet you would never ever think that, right? You would never ever ever think that that the educational system taught you something that was A, untrue, and B, not to your benefit. Of course that's the case. I mean, we're to the point where that's the given assumption, right? And if you know anything about the history of the educational system, I am going to get into MMT in Canada. If you know anything about the history of the educational system in the United States, it was brought to the United States from a country called Prussia, which is essentially the eastern part of Germany these days. It was the biggest chunk of the German nations that got swallowed up into the greater Germany, right? And the Prussian educational system was developed after Napoleon invaded Prussia in 1806. I want to say it was the Battle of Jena. Could be wrong on that. Maybe it was 1808. Can't remember. And the Prussians were a militaristic society, and their military was a military of professionals, and they prided themselves very much on their military. And Napoleon comes through, and he has a military of amateurs. So I mean, if you look at this historically, this is actually the beginning of moving from a professional or mercenary army structure to a, get as many civilian citizens from a country as possible and give them all guns and have these mass death machine battles that eventually lead into World War I. It starts with Napoleon because he starts conscripting this amateur army, and Napoleon's amateur army mops the floor with Prussia's professional army, which hurts the ego of Prussia. And there's a man by the name of Johann Fichte. Yes, I pronounced that correctly. I learned German while I lived in Austria, although I'm sure some German would make fun of my Österreichische accent. So Prussia gets its teeth punched in, its teeth kicked in by Napoleon, and Johann Fichte, who was, I believe, the head of the University of Berlin at this time, writes an open letter to the King of Prussia. It's called Speeches to the German Nation. So you can get in the book, where he essentially argues that the reason we lost this war is because our soldiers engage too much in critical thinking. Okay? Our soldiers engage too much in critical thinking. What they're doing is when they receive orders, they don't just do the orders, they think about them and decide whether or not they like the order. We can't have that. We need them doing the orders. So the solution is to create a form of compulsory education where the children, when they're taught, are taken away from the parents so we can divorce them from the culture of their parents, and institute our own culture. And in that culture, we want to make sure that they are smart enough to read the order, essentially, but too dumb to question it. They have the capability of reading, of getting the information, but they don't have the critical thinking capacity to question it. Thereby, we can create a society of good and obedient workers and soldiers. Horace Mann was the first American to get a Prussian PhD, because for a while, the PhD is a Prussian idea, right? And the only place you could get them for a while was in Prussia. Horace Mann, the first American to get a Prussian PhD, comes back to America and later becomes the governor of Massachusetts. I want to say in or before 1850. And the first compulsory educational system in the United States occurs in Massachusetts under the guidance of Horace Mann. So when we have an educational system, it's important to keep it in context that its initial purpose was to remove critical thinking from the student and get the student to engage in actions, activities, thoughts, worldviews that promoted the desires and the needs of the state, not the individual. And that the individual was actually, if the individual promoted their own desires above the state, that's in conflict with the state, and we need to stamp that out. So the whole premise of the educational system is we don't need to give you information because it's true. We need to give you information because it's good for the state. It's good for those in charge. Okay? So when we get to economics, I'm wandering far from Canada, but I'm coming back to it. When we get to economics, I never took an economics class in high school. I never took an economics class in college. I thought it was dumb. I thought it was a waste of time. I didn't have any good reason for saying this, for thinking this. But it was just something that completely I wasn't interested in at all. And I have come to the determination that that was actually a benefit for me because I didn't have to unlearn anything. Because as we discuss on the show, basically ad nauseum, and we're going to continue saying it out ad nauseum, is that the fundamental premises in the economic landscape, and this includes the neoclassical economic landscape that you would more or less get in a professional educational setting or an official educational setting, high school, college, whatever, and its supposed counterpart, the Austrian School of Economics, both rest on fundamental errors in their fundamental premises. What do I mean by that? So, well, let's look at a concrete example and I'll unpack it from there. So, there's this thing, for example, about the national debt in the United States. How are we ever going to pay off the national debt? And that's bad, right? We got to pay it off. It's a problem because if we don't pay it off, our kids have to pay it off, and that's not fair to them because they didn't take on the debt. But how are we going to do it, right? We keep borrowing all this money, and if we raise taxes, we could raise taxes as much as we can, but that's not going to be enough to pay it. So do we have to cut spending? Like how do we get control of this national debt? And then, boom, we have two sides of the equation, right? Or actually even more. So let's throw in the libertarian, the conservative right, the neoliberal left, the crazy leftists, right? Where it's all what do we do about this debt? You ask the libertarians, you ask the ANCAPs, they're like, just cut all government spending now and the free market will take care of everything, right? You get the conservatives that are like, the government services are good, but we got to stop this wasteful spending on these other things. So we'll lower the taxes and we'll lower the spending, and then we'll get the debt under control that way. And in fact, we want to propose a balanced budget amendment for the federal government. The neoliberals are more like, we got to spend a lot more because that's the government takes care of people by spending a lot more. So the way we're just going to deal with it is by taxing the rich. And honestly, I don't even know what the crazy leftists are thinking. They're probably actually closer to the anarchists and the libertarians, which is like, burn it all down and we'll replace it with a communist state. But what's fascinating about all these viewpoints is they're all flat-ass wrong. And the reason they're flat-ass wrong isn't because their calculations are bad. It's because their fundamental premises are wrong. And I mean, I don't want to get this down into like the barter theory of money versus the credit theory of money, but you kind of have to start there. You kind of have to start there because there's this assumption, and I've heard you'll read it in any standard textbook on economics, which I've never read because but I'm told that any standard textbook on economics, when it starts talking about money, they say, okay, imagine a village. And this village doesn't have any money, and people have to get goods and services, but they don't have a medium of exchange to do it, and so that they have to use barter. And then with barter, you get this issue with the dual coincidence of wants, where you have nails and I have leather hides, but you don't want leather hides, but I want nails, and so how do we deal with it, right? And because this is such a complicated system, at some point there's one thing that gets traded the most, and that thing eventually becomes money. And typically in history, that thing has been precious metal, either silver or gold. Now, what's fascinating about this description, it was the absolute first word I said in it, the word imagine. Imagine it's like this, imagine it's like that. There's never any, hey, we looked at historical, archaeological, and anthropological evidence to see that this is the way that money systems work, and this is what we found. There's never any of that. It's just imagine. And when you do look at the anthropological, the archaeological, and the, what was the third one I said? Historical, thank you. To myself, I guess. There's nobody here reminding me that was the word. When you look at those, you see that the evidence much more strongly supports a credit theory of money. Now, without doing a deep dive into that, we've done other shows doing a deep dive into that. There's two basic inferences that you could draw from either the barter or the credit theory of money. If the barter theory of money is true, it argues that markets exist before states. And the markets exist, they start trading, and then the state comes along and then says, hey, I need some of those goods and services so I can run what I run, right? And then depending on your political leaning, you see that as good, bad, or indifferent, right? Where the Austrian camp, the libertarians and the ANCAPs would say, oh, this is evil. This is morally bad because these people are utilizing coercion and violence in order to get these resources without producing anything. And then maybe a more conservative right or maybe on the left, they're saying, hey, somebody's got to make the rules and someone has to provide security. So this is the way of providing security. Whatever the argument is for why it's happening or why it should or shouldn't be happening, it's untrue. It's untrue. What the evidence appears to support, and there's a great book you can read on this called Debt the First 5,000 Years by David Graeber, is that states existed before markets. What? How does that make sense? States existed before markets. Even if you look at tribal societies, typically the tribal chief is in charge of the economy. You get this, you get that, I get this, we're going to do this with these things, we're going to do that with those things. And once a state gets advanced enough, the society starts to develop some sort of credit system. And in Debt the First 5,000 Years, he just goes over example after example after example, looking at anthropology, looking at history, looking at archaeology of these different credit systems that get created. And then once the credit system is created, you're now able to exchange the credit thing, whatever it is, for the good and the service. And so it's less accurate to say, okay, people are trading and then strongman comes along and starts taxing and that becomes the government. It's more accurate to say there's always a strongman. But once the strongman initiates, and by strongman, I mean both like a tribal leader and, it could be an oligarchy, whatever the governmental structure is, right? Whatever the state becomes. Once that state becomes sophisticated enough that there is some sort of token it uses within the society, not for economic purposes. I'm clear about that. Not for economic purposes, but for usually honor purposes, religious purposes, social status purposes. I mean, one of the examples that he gives in the book is in ancient Ireland, that And apparently this is like all written down. Like you could find this in the historical record if you could find the ancient Irish manuscripts or the stone writings or whatever the heck they were written on. Is there was this elaborate system of points assigned to like everything in the society, and something not very valuable would be 1 point. Something incredibly valuable would be like 7 points, right? I don't remember if it's 1 to 7, but we're going to go with it for the sake of this conversation. Where a slave girl, for example, would be worth 1 point, and a king might be worth 7 points. So, and maybe a cow is worth 2 points, right? So, if I steal your cow, the law might require that I pay you 2 points because the cow is worth 2 points. Well, I have some slave girls, and because each slave girl is 1 point, I can give you 2 slave girls in exchange for the cow. Now, if you're not aware of what's going on inside the society, you might say, oh, well, look, they bartered slaves for cows. No, they're exchanging points. And the points now become, they're originally set up for honor purposes or justice purposes, right? Societal rank purposes. But they start turning into the money. And as we get more and more advanced, and we get to taxes, once a state figures out to tax the money that it's creating, to tax the token that it's creating, and it leaves more token in existence than it taxes out, now the market, I'll call it the private sector, now has a unit by which it can create a market out of. Now, whether you believe this or not, I'll keep going, but whether you believe this or not, do you see how this is a completely different story from the barter theory of money? This is a completely different story with the barter theory of money that has wildly different implications. So, let's go into Roman times. And I believe the book gives example of this as well. Romans conquered like everybody, right? And often when they would conquer an area, one of the first things they would do is take all the gold and all the silver, the precious metals. They take it away from the local population, melt it down into coins, pay the soldiers with those coins, and then turn around to the conquered population and say, hey, you owe us taxes in these coins. Now, that's interesting because they already had all the coins, right? What do they need the coins? I mean, if they already have them, what do they need them for? Well, now what happens is the private sector, the conquered population, now has an incentive to work for the soldier who could pay them in the coin that they need in order to pay their taxes. Follow me so far? So the state can create an arbitrary token. Now, I know in this case, I said the token was stamped on gold, but even if the token isn't stamped on gold, which the original Roman Empire, not Roman Empire, the original Roman kingdom that led into the Republic, actually stamped their money on bronze. It wasn't until 200 and something-ish BC, I believe it was either during or after the Second Punic War, that they switched to silver coins. So for hundreds and hundreds of years, Rome ran on bronze money, which is completely anathema to anyone who adheres to the barter theory of money, because they're like, well, bronze isn't worth that much compared to the gold and silver. How does that make any sense? It makes sense because it was the legal value of the coin which gave value to the money to begin with. So the way money works isn't that the private sector creates the money and then the state taxes it. The way that money works is that the state creates it out of nothing. They snap their fingers. Get my hand on film here. They snap their fingers and they create the money out of nothing. And then the way that they make it valuable, because I could create money out of nothing right now. I'm going to make some Dellen dollars. Does that mean you want to work for it? Probably not. Unless I say, hey, person listening to this on the other side, if you don't pay me 10 Dellen dollars by the end of the month, I'm going to come take you and put you in jail and take your house and take everything in your house. And by the way, here's my army to support me in doing that. Suddenly, Dellen dollars are now very valuable to you, right? And you go, well, how do I get Dellen dollars? Well, you come and work for me. Now, again, a libertarian or an ANCAP, or maybe someone more fiscally conservative, should be smart enough to say, hey, wait a minute. Isn't this just a sneakier way of doing confiscation? And I would say yes. This is a violent movement of goods and resources from the private sector to the public sector. But what's diabolically genius about it is that the private sector doesn't feel it. They feel the taxes, but they don't realize that they're transferring their private sector wealth over to the public sector through this system in order to chase this arbitrary token. And modern money theory is really a misnomer. And we've actually spoken to Warren Mosler about this. He's the guy who came up with modern money theory. He's like, yeah, it's kind of a misnomer because it doesn't just explain money in the modern terms. It explains all money. Because the initial point is that the state has to create the money first before it can tax it. States can't tax and spend. That doesn't make any sense. They have to spend, then tax. And Mosler was actually he was a trader, and I don't remember the story of how he was able to find this out, but when you look at the accounting procedure that the government uses when it comes to bringing, spending money out and bringing taxes in, the money goes out before the taxes come in. The money always goes out before the taxes come in. And you got to think about it, right? And I know there's a private banking system and the Federal Reserve, blah, blah, blah. We've done shows on that too. That makes the landscape more complicated, but it does not change the fundamental reality, which is that if the state doesn't create the money first, there is no money to begin with. So the amount of money that the state spends more than it taxes in is the amount of money that's left inside of the private sector so the private sector can do business to begin with. You guys hear that? Unless there's a deficit, the private sector, a federal deficit, let me be clear about that, the states don't create their own money, only the federal government does. Unless there's a federal government deficit, the private sector doesn't have any money to work with. So when it's called the national debt, it is categorically different. I mean, I would even say it's a misnomer. It's not even really a debt. It's how much money the government's created versus how much money they've taken back, and what's left over is the money that the private sector gets to use. Now, there's so many implications of this. Because if what I'm saying is true, it entirely changes the conversation, right? Because now, I want to be clear, because normally when people listen to this for the first time, they say, oh yeah, you just want to increase the deficit and you don't care about inflation, you just want to spend more money and create money. If you go back and listen to what I just said, you will notice that I didn't say any of those things. I did not say any of those things. I have not given a single should in my description here. I've only given the description. I'm just describing the playing field. So far, I have not said what I think should happen on that playing field. Now, I do have some ideas about what I think should happen on that playing field, but honestly, they're kind of uninteresting until we all realize how the playing field works. Or enough of us realize how the playing field works that we can actually have a strategy on the playing field. Because if I come out and say, hey, let's just completely get rid of income tax. Let's completely get rid of Social Security and Medicare tax. Keep Social Security. Keep Medicare. Don't worry too much about the government spending. We'll replace it with some minor tax, either tariffs or maybe a property tax on real estate. Very small. And just let everybody keep their money. And, maybe we should bring the spending down, but for the most part, leave it alone. To someone who is in the mode of barter theory of money, essentially, where, oh my God, we have to pay off this debt, where's the money going to come from? That sounds absolutely asinine. It sounds completely crazy. But if you understand how economies actually work, how money actually works, that the state has the monopoly authority to be the sole issuer of that currency. Meaning, if the state doesn't print it, it doesn't exist. There's no other place for the money to come from. But though in the private banking sector, yes. The private banking sector has license to issue money, to create money from the state, right? I mean, the state like has its death grip around the private banking system, in quotes private, to follow rules that it says these are the rules on how you shall and shall not create money and what you shall and shall not create it for. So, I mean, to call it the private banking system, it's really more like a public-private partnership. But going back to just again, the premise here. What's the premise? Again, I have my idea, and it's not even worth me telling you my idea about what should happen because we're not on the same page on what the playing field is, right? Or what's on the chessboard. You have a completely idea of what the chessboard looks like. You have a completely idea of what the pieces are and how they move, and what it takes to win the game from me. And maybe I'm wrong, but I think the evidence supports my theory that I'm propounding here of how the economic system works, which is to say there has to be a deficit in order for the private sector to have money to begin with. So going back to Canada, there's a third component here. So in this very simplified economy that I've drawn out here, you've got the money creator and the money user, the public sector and the private sector. And depending on how much the private sector spends and how much how much the public sector spends and how much the public sector taxes is going to be how much money that the private sector has left over to use. There's actually a third player called the foreign sector. So if the foreign sector brings goods and services into the country, money leaves the country, and that's a drain on the money out of the country that the country gets to use. Or if we're sending goods and services over to that country, we get more money. It's in a foreign currency, but typically a central bank, at least in a modern day, you could take your foreign currency to the central bank. They'll just keep it and give you the local currency. Or I mean, that's if you don't even just go on the open market and trade the currency the way you want to trade it. That's a third player in what's going on here. So when you look at the fact that the United States in general is a net importer of goods and is also a net importer of goods from Canada, that means we have more goods and services coming in and money going out, which is a drain on that private sector. And there's a very specific term for this. I don't want to go into defining it just now because then I'll have to go into the private banking system. Private sector net savings. That's the amount of money left over that the private sector gets to use and just have. A trade imbalance is a drain on that. Now, where I would challenge Trump on this is that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, think about it. If money is just this arbitrary token that a state snaps its fingers and says, well, here's this legal thing that I just made up, and the only reason I left that part out. The only reason it's valuable is because I'm demanding a tax on it locally. I'm going to give you this thing that I just made up, and you give me real goods and services. It's not that bad of a deal, right? Especially because, hey, we could just print more for our own local population, and we'll have enough to work with. Now, this gets complicated because there's an additional argument to be made that, well, we don't want to do that so much that we become dependent on everybody else. That we can't manufacture our own goods and services, and so let's say Canada is now making everything for us, kind of like China is right now, right? Canada is making everything for us, or China is making everything for us, and our own industry shuts down, and one day China or Canada wakes up and says, hey, we're not going to trade steel with you anymore. We're not going to trade fertilizer with you anymore, or whatever thing that we quit making on our own, and we go, oh, crap, what do we do? That turns into a national security issue, right? And there's actually a pretty good example of this. I can think of two examples, actually, that I think are worth pointing out. The first is Spain. When Spain discovered not discovered the Americas, but when the conquistadors start going over there and enslaving everybody and slaughtering everybody and taking all the gold and silver and bringing it back to Spain, there was a time of crazy inflation. And if you take the neoclassical view, you would say, look, they widely and drastically increased the specie in circulation by bringing this gold and silver back from the the Americas. So that's the reason why all the prices went up. But the story is a little more complicated than that, because the gold actually went one place and the silver went another, and Spain wasn't the final destination. So at the time, and I learned this from a couple sources, but one in particular was Dr. E. Michael Jones' book, Barren Metal. I've interviewed him on the book twice on the show now, where he was going over the philosophical mindset of trade and economics at the time, held by those in charge of Spain. I don't remember the name of the guy. There was some thinker at the time who was basically proposing or arguing for the fact that money is wealth. It's not land. It's not sheep. It's not slaves. It's not goods and services. It's not manufacturing. It's not blah, whatever. It's money. If you got wads of cash, you are wealthy. And that was the thinking that had infected the at least the Spanish conquistadors, the Spanish aristocrats, the Spanish thinking population, right? Ruling population. So they're going out going, okay, let's go crazy finding this gold and silver. And I mean, that's all the stories of the conquistadors are anyway. They're just like this gold and silver nutbags trying to find all this gold and silver. They bring all this gold and silver over back to Spain. And so the Spanish ruling elite, instead of focusing on developing its own industry, just goes crazy getting all this gold and silver because wealth equals money. Now, where did the silver go? The silver actually ended up in China. Because at the time, China had a silver standard. So there was a legal proclamation, essentially, that silver would be the money of the realm. And China just started sucking in all the silver from all over the world. And when you look in particular, and I want to make sure I remember this right. I got to think this out. There was a gold and silver trade imbalance between the East and the West, which I learned from reading the Lost Science of Money by Steven Zarlinga. Let's see. The silver to gold ratio in Europe typically was somewhere between 12 to 16 to 1. So either 12 units of silver would equal 1 unit of gold, or 16 units of silver would equal 1 unit of gold, and it would slide around in between those two. In India, it was more like 7 to 1. So the silver in India bought a lot more gold. So you could bring silver from Europe, buy silver in Europe, bring it to India, and get twice as much gold as you would for that silver in India than you would in Europe. So first off, there was this natural flow to the east simply for that reason. And then once China goes onto the silver standard, China just becomes silver crazy, silver starving. All the silver starts moving over there. So the silver goes to the east, over to China. The gold actually ends up in France. Because once the Spanish devote all of their time, energy, and effort toward, finding cash as opposed to developing industry, they didn't have any industry, so they said, hey, France, can you build some stuff for us? We got all this money. And all the money floated over to France. And France developed its economy. And then Spain's sitting there holding the bag going, well, now we don't have any money. And then we don't have any manufacturing. Right? And the MMT argument, not that, increasing the money supply can't affect inflation. And by that specifically, I mean, it's not like that doesn't necessarily affect prices. It's complicated. But what definitely affects prices is if you destroy production. Right? If you say, okay, we were making all this stuff and all this money was exchanging hands in order to facilitate making and buying and selling all this stuff, and we're just going to get rid of all that manufacturing, now you have the same amount of money chasing less goods and services because they all got destroyed. So I would argue that the inflation in Spain was actually a result of manufacturing getting destroyed. And the reason I told you that whole story, one, because it's fascinating, at least to me. But second, that manufacturing is a national fucking security issue. Right? You don't just want to buy everything from everywhere else and be like, oh, we could just, at least back then they had to go find the gold and silver because everybody was on this gold and silver standard. Now, everything is just, we put it on digital currency or whatever. We don't just want to infinitely do that and make it so we don't, manufacture anything here. Everybody else is making stuff for us. And then suddenly we wake up and everyone's like, nah, we're not going to work with you anymore. Because, let me give you another example, Germany. So when the Industrial Revolution starts in England, early 1700s, this was roughly the time of Adam Smith. I know Adam Smith was more like late 1800s, or excuse me, late 1700s. So, I mean, the Industrial Revolution really starts in the early 1700s and is really starting to crystallize in the late 1700s. This whole free market ideology starts popping up out of Scotland, I believe, if I remember correctly. And it's really this idea that puts this emphasis on the market is doing everything. The market is doing everything. And if the state does anything, it's only getting into the way to this natural equilibrium of the market that's going to fix everything. That's another thing. There's no such thing as that natural equilibrium. The invisible hand that Adam Smith came up with was his attempt to introduce providence, to introduce God into his economic system, to give it this equilibrating factor, this equilibrating importance, similar to Isaac Newton, where Isaac Newton puts forward this idea that, hey, we have this self-propelling universe that resolves itself between the tension of gravity and inertia, so we're able to calculate how everything is going to go between these two opposing forces. And Adam Smith was trying to create up something similar, but because, a social science is a little more complicated than a physical science because you have independent actors making free will decisions, people inside of it, that's not so easy to do, and he cheated by having this thing called the invisible hand, which magically, puts everything where it needs to go in the free market economy, and that anytime the state comes and puts its finger in anything, it screws up that balance, right? So the most important thing from this perspective is to get the state out of the way. I mean, this is the ANCAP and libertarian thinking, right? This is the Austrian economics thinking. Get the state out of the way so the free market can voluntarily exchange the way it wants. Now, that sounds good until you see how it got applied. And the way that it got applied, I'll bring Ireland into this too. The way that it got applied is that once England had the Industrial Revolution, it was the first country that had it. It was the first country that had mass manufacturing, and it's looking at its enemies, like Germany, across the water going, hey, how do we really mess them up? And they said, hey, if we can make them buy our goods, we can undercut everybody in Germany because they're not mass manufacturing. They still have crafts and guilds and skilled laborers and stuff, right? And they'll go out of business. Their own manufacturing capacity will be destroyed, and they'll be helpless. And the Germans weren't dumb. They're like, no, tariffs, boom. You can't compete with us. So England went to war to force them open, to force on this, in quotes, free market economy. And that's your first indication that it's not free market, right? Is, hey, anytime the government touches anything, it's bad. So we need to let the market figure things out. Oh, you're not doing what we want. Hey, bring in the military and blow them up until they do what we want. Oh, yeah, look, now we have a free market. Isn't it great? We're all voluntarily. I mean, it's just asinine. And then not that long after that, roughly at the same time, Ireland has the potato famine, and millions of people are literally starving to death, and the English will not allow a moratorium on food exports, right? Because there's people in Ireland that said, hey, stop exporting this food because we need to eat it here, we're starving. And the English go, no, that would inhibit the free market. Yeah, that would be the government getting in the way of the free market, and that would be bad for, whatever the reasons were. So if it benefits them, free market's great. If it does benefit them, they send in the military, right? But again, this is just it's a national security thing. I guess there was two wide examples there between Ireland and Germany. Is that yes, there's this idea of we want to voluntarily exchange between each other, but there is a way for different countries to go to economic warfare to have economic warfare against each other. And one of the ways, or two of the ways that they could do that, the first one was, for example, with Germany. Spain kind of did it to itself. But with England doing it to Germany, if we sell you this mass manufactured stuff, we can destroy your economy because you can't compete with us, leaving you in a vulnerable position. Or on the flip side, you guys are having a absolute catastrophe and everybody's starving. Well, we're going to prevent you from putting tariffs on your own country for exports that would keep the food inside the country, or putting a moratorium or whatever to keep the food to feed the people, because that wouldn't benefit our trade, right? So it's a national security issue to be able to control this sort of thing, and to turn the dials appropriately. However, the national debt should not be part of the conversation of this, right? Because like I said, the national debt is just a measure of, how much money has gone out versus come back in, and how much money the private sector gets to use. I mean, the national debt should probably be, more accurately said, the people's surplus. Because whatever the national government is in debt in, that's what the people have to work with. So it should be called the people's surplus. Right? Imagine how different the conversation would be if we had the people's surplus. So go back to Trump, go back to Canada. You thought I wasn't going to come back to Canada. You thought I wasn't going to make it back to Canada. So here we are, call the 51st state, making fun of Trudeau, governor of the 51st state, and all this sort of thing. And I think he's, like I said, framing the negotiation that he's going to have, because he's concerned about this trade deficit. If that's true, I think he's doing it all for the wrong reasons. If he's doing it to try to get a hold of the national debt, or that, we want to make money off of Canada, not just Canada making money off of us, it's a terrible reason. A good reason might be, hey, we want to, like, if Canada's tariffing us, but we're not tariffing them, which means our industry would be more developed, because it would also be selling to Canada than it otherwise would be. Yeah, I could see that. But insgesamt, I love that word in German. In general, in total here, it's a really excellent point to show two dynamics. The first dynamic is how stupid the modern current economic conversation is. It's completely off in la-la land, talking about a system that does not represent reality in the slightest. And all sides of the political aisle, I mean, draw your damn, I can't think of the name, but the two-dimensional political scale. The name's entirely escaping me right now. Where on one, you got economics on one side and authoritarianism on the other, and Nazis are over here and communists are over there and libertarians are there, whatever. Any of those arguments are all wrong, because they're applying their arguments to a system that does not accurately represent reality. Let's understand the system. Let's create a model, or let's accept a model that more accurately represents reality. Then we can apply our political opinions on what should or shouldn't happen there, and we'll be able to have a more realistic conversation, not this arguing about, the national debt, the people's surplus. And in terms of dealing with something like Canada, and dealing with national security, and wanting to create a good relationship with our neighbors, and maybe even save the Canadians while they're at it from their own insanity government going on over there, we could do that a little bit more effectively if we had a better idea of how the system actually works. So that was a pretty good rant. Someone can let me know, what did I make it? Was I good at making an overall point, or did I bounce around too much? But this has been Dylan Moore with iReada TV. You can find us at iReada.tv. Check out our iReada TV YouTube channel, IRIDA TV. And I appreciate you watching, and see you next time. By the way, please like, subscribe, share. I hate saying this. I feel so slimy saying this, but apparently if you don't say it, you pay for it, right? I don't ask you for any goddamn money. And I think what I say on here is useful. If you want to see something really useful, go listen to my track on intellectual self-defense. My 3-part series on intellectual self-defense. It will change your damn life. I ask you for $0 from it. So please like, share, and subscribe, and share this with your friends who have very, very bad views on the premises of how the economy works.